Welcome to our show, The Hidden History of India. Today, we have the privilege and honor to welcome a distinguished scholar, historian, and author from Netherlands, Dr. Koenraad Elst. He has demolished Aryan invasion theory. He is probably the only Western historian who claimed that Babri Masjid in Ayodhya was built over a pre-existing Hindu temple dedicated to Lord Ram. He has been a vocal critic of Indian Marxist historians like Rumila Thapar, Irfan Habib, accusing them of distorting history to fit political agendas. Welcome, sir.
Pleased to meet.
Recently, Mallikarjun Kharge in Rajya Sabha, he was screaming. He was saying, I'm a Dravidian. You all are Aryans. What do you make out of this statement?
Well, it's trivial in the sense that we all know that he's a Dravidian speaker, Kannada, I believe,
Yes.
one of the Dravidian languages. So, we all know that. And so that's a statement without any real consequence. It might mean that an average speaker of Gujarati or Punjabi or so will have a problem understanding him, except insofar as there is a large Sanskrit vocabulary in common between practically all the Indian languages. But so no, I mean, at a basic level, non-Kannada speakers will feel uncomfortable
Yes.
in his company unless they learn Kannada. So that's okay, that's a fact of life between speakers of different languages. So what else is new?
Why he was calling North Indians Aryans? Who are these Aryans?
Yeah, well, the word Aryan was coined in the late 18th century by the so-called father of Orientalism. So he coined it in French, Aryan, which meant the people of Indo-Iranian provenance, so meaning the North Indians and the Iranians in the large sense, the Kurds, the Scythians or Ossets, the Tajiks, and so on. So they all speak languages coming from either Sanskrit or Avestan, where the word Arya is used in self-reference. And so he confined it to that, whereas later it is Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel in 1808, who started using it in the sense of Indo-European. That's a family of languages which includes North Indian and Iranian languages, as well as Slavic, Celtic, Baltic, Germanic, Italic, Albanian, Armenian, and Greek. So from then on, the Sanskrit word Arya was used in these European languages in a new meaning, namely Indo-European, in a new linguistic meaning. Mind you, we're not there yet. So in that sense, the North Indians could be called Aryans. So that
So this is
meaning
the
was never given as long as it was used in Sanskrit, but so Europeans started using it in that sense.
okay. This is the word Aryan.
Yes.
So what is the genesis of this Aryan invasion theory?
Well, people started getting the impression when they were confronted with Indian languages. By people here, I mean, excuse me, Eurocentrically, the European travelers who went to India. So on the coast of India, they met Konkani or Gujarati or so, and they noticed certain similarities with their own native Italian or Portuguese or so tongue. And then a few more erudite people started studying this in depth, and so they started sensing a connection, very systematic connection, not just words resembling in sound, because that may be a very superficial resemblance, but the grammar in common and so on. And so a few people started systematically researching this, and it is in the 18th century the French Jesuit Gaston Laurent Coeur who sends a paper to the academy in Paris. He himself lived in Andhra Pradesh,
Okay.
and so he was familiar with Indian languages. And so his study focused on Sanskrit, comparing with Latin and Greek. So in his paper, he argued that, obviously these languages have a common origin. So it landed in Paris in 1767. The next year is one of the first to really read the paper and understand its impact was the freethinker Voltaire. And so he made it better known. He was a well-known intellectual, and so he drew attention to it. He at once did something that is becoming normative almost in the history of Indo-European linguistics. Namely, he instrumentalized it ideologically. So in his case, he was an ex-Catholic with an agenda, let's say, against the church. And so here he saw a great opportunity in diminishing the importance of Christianity in European culture. He pointed out that, the influence of Christianity is something that at some point in history has been superimposed on what is the real nature of European culture, which, he said, was now shown by linguistics to originate in India. So he said explicitly, the cradle of European culture is on the banks of the Ganga.
Okay, that was Voltaire.
Yeah.
But in India, we are being taught that the Aryans came from Central Asia, or maybe somebody says it is, Latvia or some place in
Yeah.
Europe. So, is it true that people who were basically nomadic, they came with Vedas?
Well, first of all, that they were nomadic is not so certain. That is indeed one common theory. That they came with the Vedas, some people interpret it like that, but that's not the mainstream theory. The Vedas were created in India. And when you read the Vedas, they continually refer to Indian circumstances, Indian flora and fauna. You have the elephant there many times. You don't have the polar bear. You don't have the kangaroo. You don't have the African wildebeest, or,
Right.
So, whereas you have the cobra, the mongoose, the whole Indian flora and fauna are there. So very obviously, it's originating in India. But the story is that before that, they had come from Central Asia and maybe even farther to the west and north. And so they brought their language with them. That language came from elsewhere. And then in that language, they created poetry that gives information about India, but nevertheless contains motives, contains mythological themes, and so on, that they had brought with them, and that therefore are also to be found in Greek traditions, in Germanic traditions, and so on.
And how do you think that the Indus Valley civilization, had to do with the Vedas, or maybe it was a Vedic society.
Yes. Well, at the time of the discovery of the language family, which in the beginning most thought originated in India, so the so called out of India theory, a term coined in 1997 by Edwin Bryant, American scholar, that was already there from the beginning, from 1767. That was the dominant theory for about 60, 70 years. So those who say, oh, it's a concoction by the ugly, vicious Hindu nationalists and so on, they just don't know what they're talking about. You see, the history of this research clearly says that the out of India theory is the original theory. And in the beginning, it was challenged by a theory that today nobody will take serious anymore, namely the Armenian homeland theory. Why? Well, because Bible thumpers reasoned that the flood, as described in the Bible, ends with Noah and his sons and daughters in law landing on the Mount Ararat in Armenia, and from there repopulating the world. And so Ham, one of the sons, populated Africa, and Sem populated the Middle East, whereas the Semites, a Semitic language family, including Hebrew and Arabic. And so the Indo-Europeans are the descendants of the third brother, Japheth. So there, the alternative theory was they originate in Armenia. Now, nobody takes that biblical argument serious anymore. But it so happens that the dominant theory, when the Indian alternative came under fire, mostly opted for the region around Armenia or around the Caucasus Mountains, a little bit north or a little bit south. And so that's what the debate among European scholars mostly is about. Is it to the north, Russia, Ukraine? Is it to the south, Anatolia, Armenia, northern Iran? But it's in that region, Peri-Caucasian. So that, at the moment, is what the debate really is about. Is it around the Caucasus? Or, as quite a few now say, is it in India? And so the rebirth of the out of India theory takes place in the early 1980s due to two totally different approaches. One is by the Indian Parsi ex-secretary of Sri Aurobindo, namely K.D. Setna, who wrote a book in 1982, Karpasa, which is the Sanskrit word for cotton, where he uses the archaeology of cotton findings in the Harappan cities and their presence or absence in the Rig Veda to argue that the Veda was pre-Harappan, not post-Harappan as usually people think, and that therefore the Aryans, the Vedic people, must have been in India since at least 4,000 BCE.
Okay.
Before the Harappan cities.
Achha, okay, before the Harappan cities.
Yes, earlier.
So what do you think? What is the timeline of Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, or Indus Valley cities? How old are these cities?
Yes. Okay. Well, I was saying that there were two approaches. So one is K.D. Setna's, the other is by a few American archaeologists, mainly Jim Sheffer, who research the archaeology of the supposed Aryan invasion. And so for 100 years, there has been well-funded research trying to find traces of these Aryan invaders, and they are still not found.
Not for.
This is also recognized in a book in 1995 where the archaeology is compared with the textual evidence. And so even one of the champions of the Aryan invasion theory, Michael Witzel, admits that there is a divergence between the linguistic and the archaeological evidence, where he recognizes in so many words that there has been so far no archaeological proof for the Aryan invasion yet.
Yes. Okay. So, why then Indian historians, after independence, they went on the rooftop and started writing all kinds of books and all that Aryan invasion was the real thing? It is now that they have changed their position. But what
Yeah.
was the reason behind it?
Yeah, well, there is not much of a reason behind it. You see, when you ask for the reason behind it, now everybody in front of the screen will jump up and say, oh, it's a conspiracy. It's a colonial concoction to, tame the Indians, to make them accept their subservience to the British invaders. And indeed, there are people in the colonial establishment who made use of the Aryan invasion scenario, like Churchill, best known. He said that we have as much right to be in India as anyone
Yes.
there, except perhaps, if you want per se to give any importance to origins, then those who have the most right to India are the depressed classes, as he calls them, because they are the native stock.
Yes.
They were always in India, at least as long as mankind is. And so the upper caste Hindus are invaders. And we British are also invaders, but we have as much right to invade there as the Hindus have had. So that's a political use of the Aryan invasion theory. However, that's not at all how the theory came about.
Okay.
So it came about through perfectly honest scholarly considerations. Scholars try to make sense of the data they discover. And so this much was, of course, first of all, certain. There was a common origin between the Europeans and the Indians. So there were several possibilities. Essentially, either it was in India or it was outside of India.
Okay.
Now, there were a few linguistic considerations that made them think, well, maybe it was not India. So, first of all, in the beginning it was thought that Sanskrit was the language of origin. Latin and Greek and so on were daughters of Sanskrit. You see a number of traits in Sanskrit that are more conservative than in the other languages. For instance, in Sanskrit, you have a system of 24 forms of the noun, namely 3 numbers, singular, dual, and plural, and 8 cases, nominative, vocative, and so on. So in Latin and Greek, you only have 2 numbers. The dual number has disappeared, though there are a few words that still show a trace of the dual number. So we know that they have had the dual number but lost it. It's not the case that Sanskrit developed the dual number, which originally wasn't there. No, Sanskrit maintained the dual number, which Greek and Latin had lost. Same thing with the number of cases. So of the 8 cases in Sanskrit, the locative, instrumental, and ablative are lost in Greek. The locative and instrumental are lost in Latin. And two more are lost in Germanic. And ultimately, all are lost in English or in French. Many languages like Hindi still have two cases. But so at any rate, you can see that that is a development or degeneration, if you want to judge that, from an original situation with 8 cases and 3 numbers, which you find in Sanskrit. So the original opinion was that Sanskrit is the ur form of this language family. Now, in subsequent decades, scholars discovered that in fact Sanskrit clearly also has evolved. Like, for instance, you see in the sound system that in many cases the K sound has become ch or sh, like de cam in Latin becomes dasha in Sanskrit. And or the vowels like de cam has twice the a sound, which collapses into ah in Sanskrit dasha. And so, in a not entirely logically justified manner, they deduced that if Sanskrit was not the mother of all the other languages, then maybe India was not the homeland of all the other
Okay.
languages. So maybe the homeland was outside of India.
Outside.
Then, in the mid 19th century, a new approach was developed, namely linguistic paleontology. So they said a language is spoken in an area of which it carries the signs. For example, if a language is spoken in the Arctic, some of the northern animal and plant species are going to be present in the vocabulary of that
Right.
language. And effectively, you find, for instance, bears and wolves, or you find the birch tree, which in India only exists in Kashmir, is typical for a colder climate. So they said, okay, since these colder climate species are present, the original Proto-Indo-European language must have been spoken in a cold area in the north, so not in India. Now, after that, you see, there has been critical rethinking of that approach, and you see, it has been realized, for example, India does have cold areas, namely the mountains. India has these supposed cold climate species. There are wolves and bears in India. So this argument is not really very strong. And in fact, you could turn it around. This is what Shrikant Talageri has done. He finds a few hot climate species, including the elephant, typical for India,
Typical
not
for-
present in any other Indo-European speaking country. You find them present in the original vocabulary. So that the vocabulary points to the north is not so certain, and in fact is just not true. But for a century or so, that was the dominant assumption. So people thought that they were just true to scientific findings in positing a homeland outside of India.
Okay. So that is the theory.
Yeah.
Well, I want to discuss one more topic, and that is Ram Mandir at Ayodhya.
Yeah.
So why did these historians they went up to the Allahabad High Court? They submitted evidences and they got exposed. So why these historians they have to be always on the wrong side? Because archaeologically it was proven that all those people who were claiming
Yeah.
that there was never any temple beneath that masjid.
Hmm.
So they suddenly they were all exposed.
Yeah, okay. Initially, archaeology was not in the game, but there was plenty of testimony. There were many documents attesting to the existence, or very certainly, even among Muslims, the belief in the existence of a temple at the site. In the 19th century, there was a trial when local Hindus claimed the mosque as a temple. And so it turned out that all parties concerned, including the Muslims, including European travelers who had been there, including the British judge who finally passed judgment, were all in agreement that the mosque had been built in forcible replacement of a temple. That was not at all the issue. So there was a consensus about that. It's only the question about what to do with it. So the British judge said, yes, it's unfortunate that this temple was destroyed, but since it happened so long ago,
Let's
there's no
forget.
point in reviving the issue. Now, that, of course, you can discuss whether this is the correct conclusion, but at any rate, the initial consensus that, of course, there was a temple there that has not been factually challenged. It is not that the so-called eminent historians of those days had made a discovery that cast doubt on the consensus. That consensus was totally unchallenged. Of course, there was a temple there, but in 1989, they issued from JNU a statement alleging that the temple was a concoction by the... Well, first they said by the British, and indeed I recently met one of the anti-temple historians from back then, gray-haired by now, still maintaining that it had been a British concoction, which even the eminent historians at the time discarded as untenable. So they said that it was a Hindu concoction. Anyway, it was nothing of the sort.
Right.
It was no concoction, it was just a fact. In the 70s, B.B. Lal, the dean of Indian archaeology, did excavations at Ramayana sites, including the birthplace site. And so he found the foundations of a temple, stretching far wider than the mosque that had been built there. He was ordered by the prime minister at the time, Indira Gandhi, not to whisper about it to anyone. You see, this was explosive material. So around 1990, of course, everything was dug up. All kinds of documents were drawn attention to. And so it turned out that there were, even in Muslim institutions, plenty of proofs for perhaps not the temple, but certainly for belief in the temple. All Muslims assumed that there had been a temple there.
Okay.
And so that became hard to deny. So Rajiv Gandhi, who thought of some compromise, giving the temple to the Hindus and then some other sweeteners for the Muslim leadership. So he thought of having the temple built. And so he had debates, a meeting called together of scholars to discuss the evidence on the understanding that if there had been a temple in the past, then there should be a temple in the future.
Right.
If nothing was found, then we'll leave it like that. So that's a polite way of saying, let's build a temple, because every insider knew that there was evidence for a temple. So that meeting took place or did not really take place, because only the scholars who asserted the pre-existence of a temple showed up. Those who were against the temple failed to show up. Though sometime later they issued a booklet, Historians Report to the Nation, where they argued that there was no temple.
Right.
Right. But then a few years later, after the demolition of the Babri Masjid and so on, after a lot of political events, it was finally the High Court of Uttar Pradesh that took the whole case to heart. And so that court ordered serious archaeological excavations at the site, which did find many temple remains and the foundations of the temple. And it also ordered a serious investigation of the documents, including questioning the historians who had taken a stand at the time around 1990. And so that was a humiliating experience for the eminent historians,
Yes.
who had to admit that actually.
And everything is written down in the judgment itself. How these
Yeah.
historians they lied.
Mhm.
There's a whole complete 3 pages
Yeah.
devoted to these eminent historians.
Yes.
Okay, why did you come here to, give us fake theories and all?
Yeah.
And they were thoroughly exposed. Last question that I want to ask. You have gone to the different parts of the world. You have studied the history of the world. Can you imagine or can you draw a parallel the way Muslim invaders they looted and exploited India?
Mhm.
Is there any parallel to this?
Well, yes. I mean, looting and killing and so on, that's quite common throughout human history. To do it specifically for ideological and for religious reasons, that is less common. And in this case, it is to be noted that that was a strong justification for looting and so on, so they did it with abandon. And so the resulting death toll is quite high. It runs in the millions, perhaps in the tens of millions. But, as a project, massacring people is not that unique, unfortunately. Like you have a number of genocides, people think immediately of the Holocaust, but you have, genocides that nobody heard of.
Right.
Like, for instance, the Hungarian Mongols, some 300 years ago, 1 million or so of them were systematically massacred by the Chinese. And it's a bit similar to the Holocaust in the sense that before that, like preparing the ground for that, there was heavy propaganda in China against these people, that they were savages and so on, and that it was better for everyone if we get rid of them. So that kind of thing is not exactly what the Muslims did. The result was very much the same. But, when Hindus nowadays speak of genocide, there, as a responsible historian, I have to dissent from that.
No, but
In the sense that, no, you see, a great massacre was the result. Nevertheless, Islam never had a program of eliminating the pagans, the unbelievers. There was an ideology that justified conquest, which of course does not go without some killing. But nevertheless, the ultimate goal is to convert everyone.
Okay. Why I ask this? Because nowadays there's a big debate
Yeah.
over Aurangzeb.
Yes.
People are divided because historians have taught us that he was a very noble person.
Yeah.
He was a living saint, Jinda Peer.
Yes.
And now a movie comes, it tells us the story of Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, and the country is up in
Yes.
arms.
Well, They are both right. He was a living saint. Like many emperors, waste a lot of public money on their own pet projects. Like Aurangzeb's father, he was into art and so on. He was also a great opium smoker, or I don't know how they consume opium anyway. He consumed a lot of it. Um, but so he was into art and he and into women, and so his favorite wife, when she died in her 14th, um,
While giving birth to the 14th son.
yeah, and when she delivered for the 14th time, she died. And so he built a grave monument for her, the Taj Mahal, that everybody knows. So Aurangzeb absolutely disapproved because he thought it's a waste of public money. He himself never wasted public money, or so he thought. Of course, you can say the wars he fought against the Hindus, they were a waste of public money. That's what I would say. But I mean, that he saw differently. But, wasting on useless things like a grave monument, that, he himself would never do. On the contrary, he refused to be paid from the exchequer. He made his own money, namely by making these white skull caps that sold for a good price, because after all they were from the emperor,
Yeah.
and by making calligraphic copies of the Quran. So he was a very frugal man. That much, you see, he had, in his favor compared to other emperors, Islamic and non-Islamic. So, that you can say in his favor. But he was also a bigot, a fanatic. He persecuted people. As part of that operation, he destroyed Hindu temples, Hindu murtis. And it's not that he was the one thing on the good side and the one thing on the bad side. No, the two things stem from the same motivation. You see, he was dedicated to his religion. His religion taught him, on the one hand, to live a sober life. It also taught him to prosecute
And
the
convert
infidels. Yes.
Yes.
And so these two, come from one outlook. And so I have nothing against those things said in favor of Aurangzeb. They are true. Nevertheless, the other things are also true.
Thank you so much for talking to us, sir. And I'm overwhelmed. You gave us time. You came to our studio. Thank you so much.
Okay. Pleased to meet.
So, after listening Dr. Elst, one can conclude that the evidence supporting Indian invasion theory is weak or misinterpreted. And there is a strong evidence to show that Indo European languages originated in India and spread westward. On Babri Masjid, he revealed that Rajiv Gandhi stopped ASI to reveal the truth that there was indeed a temple at the site of Babri Masjid. And with that, we come to the end of today's program. We hope you found this discussion insightful and thought provoking. Namaskar.